All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining our Dion Leadership webinar series today. Our topic today is Managers Are Cracking. Here's what we can do to fix it. Joining us today is Steve Dion, founder and CEO of Dion Leadership, and Joe LeDuc, VP of Coaching and Consulting Services at Dion Leadership.
Thank you, Genevieve, and welcome, everybody. I appreciate you taking time to join us for our Thought Leadership webinar today, and I'm very excited to share the stage today with Joe LeDuc, our VP of Coaching and Consulting Services.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see all of you. I think we have some returning faces and some new ones. So Steve and I are very excited for this particular session. We're very much eager and looking forward to get into it.
So this is, I think, our highest attended webinar to date. We've been doing this for 5 years now, and I think it speaks mostly to the topic itself and the need for organizations to work on their managerial level roles. So before we get into that, I just want to do a quick introduction about our organization and sort of why we picked this topic. And we're going to share with you today a fair amount of data about why this is an issue, and then move into some very practical, thoughtful solutions that you may want to consider implementing for your organization. And as always, we recommend and encourage you to use the chat feature. Please do chime in for things that you're doing at your organization that might be helpful, and we can use this as a way to build community.
Yeah, so I think, as we set sail out of the harbor, as a leadership and organizational development consultancy, one of the things we wanted to share with our community is we believe in the work. And if it feels like stating the obvious, well, perhaps it is, but we believe in helping organizations create workplace communities where people come into work every day and they feel excited about what they're going to do. And every day when they unplug or walk out to that parking lot, they feel a sense of accomplishment, a sense of fulfillment, and just feel complete and whole about what they're doing. And we're very devoted to this mission. So we always like to start and just address that as something we fervently believe is possible and we are indelibly committed to. And we also like to share just, a list of some of the clients that we work with. And I say this in the most sincerest fashion, that this isn't to be a brag sheet of sorts, but it's more to say everything we're going to talk about today is informed both by data and real world application. So we've done this work in small, mid to large size organizations, and it's really based on real world practice. And we've seen a lot of success. So that's another reason why we're very eager and excited to have this conversation with you today. And where do we hang our hat? Think all of your developments. So team development, organizational development, leadership development, but also too, we do a fair amount of leadership coaching, manager training, and talent assessment, and helping organizations work on and optimize their culture.
So in this first statement, we said managers are cracking. I know that's a bold statement. And why do we say that, right? How do we know this to be true? And why are we focusing on managers versus others in organizations? Well, we were inspired really to talk about this when we were doing our January webinar panel with 3 CHROs and doing research about trends that CHRO sees as important and challenging for them going into this year. And as you'll see from the data that we're going to share, this issue of leadership development, manager development is high on that list, as shown by Gartner, which is a reputable place that we like to look at their studies and data, some Harvard Business Review information. So we're going to share a little bit of that with you today. And, really one of the keys here is that while all employees can relate to this challenge, managers have an added responsibility right now of ensuring that their team members get what they need to be successful in their organization. And as we've talked about many times on this webinar series, the workplace dynamics are changing. Employees are expecting more related to work-life balance. They have more choices in the work. So not only do you as HR professionals have to deal with policies, programs, and systems to attract and retain all people, but the leader of these people are both burnt out and exhausted and challenged with their own work. And they have responsibility for leading these people that now have some added expectations about purpose and fulfillment, and then they have choice and they can go somewhere else. So it's a little bit of a 1-2 punch for a manager. And so that's why we wanted to focus on that today.
So what do we mean when we say cracking? When Steve and I were talking about this, we said, let's be a little discerning here. And when we really want to pull out the scalpel and pick this apart, what are we talking about? So we mean that at the very minimum, they're burned out, right? And, this isn't necessarily a surprising statement. But even when we talk about being burnt out, let's give that some dimension. And in our experience and in also our research, we find that there are 3 dimensions that are kind of consistent across the board. One, that managers are experiencing extreme and consistent, I'm going to use that word there, consistent exhaustion. 2, they've developed a deeply rooted cynicism. And that too is dimensional, because what we'll see is that cynicism is directed towards themselves, their peers, their colleagues, could be their direct reports, their leadership, and then the organization or the culture on a whole. And then the third element we've seen is that overall their sense of self-worth, their value, and their sense of accomplishment are routinely diminished or lie in deficit as well.
And as you think about this idea of burnout, we wanted to share this definition because you can take these 3 items and build programs and systems around measuring this. I think we've used the word burnout so often to be so generic over the last 4 or 5 years that you go, what is that? It's a very opaque term. Well, it isn't really opaque. I mean, it lands, clinically speaking, for these specific ways that the person who is burnt out acts. And so looking for these items in your workforce, I think, is really important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. And if you want to know more about burnout and work, I'm kind of one of the pioneers in this research is Christina Maslach, Maslach. So feel free to kind of Google her if you wanted to kind of understand a little bit more about burnout in the workplace.
Well, one other little cherry I would add to that sundae is, at a high level, what I think we also see is this feeling of invisibility. That's the word that sometimes comes to my mind on behalf of managers, where they feel like they are invisible. They feel unseen or they feel unheard. There's a sense of powerlessness there. And then, after that, the rabbit hole doesn't seem to be too far away. All these other things then come into play.
So let's dig into some of this data here.
Yeah.
One of the things that we found from this Gartner study is that 75% of HR leaders said that managers are overwhelmed by the growth in their job responsibilities. And it continues to change and grow, and organizations have been continuing to pile on, it seems, both in this research and in the work that we work with organizations. We hear when we run manager development programs that a manager says, I've been a manager for a long time now, and I just can't keep up with the expectation of this. One more Teams meeting, one more Zoom meeting, I'm in the office, I'm at home, there's people around the globe, it just keeps adding on top of each other. And then further, 73% of HR leaders confirm that their organization's leaders and managers aren't equipped to lead that change. So we have seen that many organizations hired a whole new crop of first-time leaders over the last 3 or 4 years who aren't seasoned in knowing how to manage these items, or people that were individual contributors and said, hey, can you manage some people now? So leadership development programs are super popular right now to teach us some of the basic skills to lead and manage the basic people responsibility activities. And then on top of that, figuring out, how do I lead somebody who's virtual, who has these different expectations? I mean, it just kind of compounds upon itself. And by the way, in just a minute, we're going to do a little poll to ask you where you guys are at. So if you are on your computer and you kind of get ready, we're going to ask you a couple poll questions.
Well, and I want to chime in on that real quick, Steve. When I think about 2023 and even into 2024, one of the more common leadership development programs that we were designing for organizations was some form of a manager essentials program, where it was everything from how do we optimize our communication skills, doing things like DISC, to how do we delegate, how do we champion accountability, how do we handle difficult conversations and manage conflict, how do we administer, feedback. So some of the core fundamental, that bedrock of what it means to be a sound leader and manager, we were seeing a lot of demand for that in the past year to year and a half.
And one of the overarching kind of reasons we're seeing behind all this is this idea of having an unsettled employee-employer relationship. So post-pandemic, people are still trying to figure out, do they want to work in this organization? Am I in? Am I out? How many days of the week do I have to go in? Is it worth it? What's the productivity, challenges for my workplace? You can see nearly 50% of employees view that their current performance as unsustainable. So the level of work we're expecting of people is super challenging, and that there's a lot of mistrust in organizations still. There's mistrust in, there's sort of the geopolitical world around us, and it's coming into workplaces. And again, as it relates to this particular topic, managers are the ones that are, shouldering the burden for having to navigate this employment relationship. And so we need to equip them with the right tools and resources to do that. On top of that, here's a couple of other pieces of data that we found is about 82% of employees are at risk of burnout this year, and only half of employers design work for that in mind. So I think there's a lot of organizations that are still dealing with their own financial challenges, supply chain issues, if you're in healthcare, margin issues, and, senior leaders just giving more work to people, not realizing the impact that it has on each worker. And then finding that, below kind of the water level here, you've got this sort of issue brewing or bubbling up. And that bosses know that their employees are burnt out, and, they are a little bit scared about to figure out how to retain that talent, and they're not quite sure what to do about it. So this is an organizational issue. We're not saying this is just a managerial issue, but why we wanted to focus this webinar on how to help managers particularly is because we think they're one of the linchpins in the organization to be able to help their employee base as well. So last little bit of data before we jump into the poll.
Yeah, so just to let each of these items sit for a moment, I think these numbers, again, may not be surprising, but still sobering at the same time. An average manager has over 50% more responsibilities than they can effectively manage. So once more, they have, for many, what they perceive as an unsustainable workload. 1 in 5 managers would prefer not being people managers, given a choice. And I can even recall in my work as a coach, this coming up as topics of conversation, where oftentimes it's just kind of following the traditional org structure, where someone may have been an individual contributor, they were great at what they did, and then they were put into a manager's role without too much consideration as to whether or not they actually wanted to lead people, whether they wanted to kind of deal more with the human element. And that can create its own set of issues. Only 1 in 2 employees say that their managers treat them with empathy and fairness. And then lastly, almost 60% of managers report spending a significant amount of time on work to do work. And I can also say in my time as a coach, this was something that thematically popped up on more than 1 or 2 or even 3 occasions.
So let's get a sense of where your organizations are at as well. And if we could ask Genevieve to launch this poll. We have 3 kind of levels of questions here for you to respond to. Either I'm really worried about the level of burnout and stress of my managers. I'm not sure kind of where they're at, or really, I'm listening in today, but we don't see any glaring issues within our organization. Our managers are thriving.
And to echo Steve's sentiment from earlier, please feel free to post thoughts or questions in the chat. We very much look at this as a communal conversation. So if you have ideas, questions, observations, experiences you want to share, please feel free to post those in the chat. We'd love to hear from
Okay,
you.
we will end this poll, and last one came in. Here we go. So we have about 85% of those on here say this is a real problem for them, and 8% say not so much, and 7% say their managers are thriving. So good for you. If you have, for those that are, those organizations that are thriving, love to hear what you're doing to create those and practices. And similarly, for those that are having challenges, if you've got initiatives going on right now, again, we really want to hear a little bit more about this. Okay. So what do we do about it? What are some of the reasons for burnout? And, we always like to approach this from both our experiences, as Joe mentioned, but also with some data. And we found that this particular there we go. Study that we want to reference was a Harvard Business Review study where Microsoft did a whole bunch of data analysis at their organization and looked at other organizations as well. And we thought that this really represented what we see in the marketplace too.
Yeah. I mean, that first bullet point, we've already referenced it in other slides. So I think it's safe to say it's more than just a trend. This real fact at this point of how common an unsustainable workload is popping up in people's managerial experiences. Also, too, a perceived lack of control, a lack of agency, a lack of autonomy. I would even anchor some of this into that invisibility that I had mentioned previously. Next would be insufficient rewards for effort. So, the output to input ratio is grossly misaligned, that there's a lot going out, but in terms of what's filling the bucket, just isn't really happening. This is something, Steve, this next one is a topic Steve and I have talked about quite a bit lately, a lack of a supportive community. Even if you think of like resource groups within an organization, just how these are lacking, and that support system being deficient is something that managers are feeling, and is contributing to the cause. We also talk about a lack of fairness is something that's come up too, as well as mismatched values and skills, whether someone may feel like they are ill fit for the role, or also that they don't necessarily feel so aligned with their organization anymore, particularly from a value standpoint.
And I really want to double down, and we're going to talk a couple times about this supportive community piece. Is we think that one of the big practices that organizations aren't doing is they're treating their employee base pretty similar. They collect data about their employees as if they're one big group. Maybe they look at managers as like a level of engagement results versus professional versus hourly, but we think the best organizations are creating communities where they're bringing leaders together to talk about what it means to be a people leader in today's environment. And if you're not doing that, possibly a missed opportunity. So, second and last poll, just wanted to get a sense from you, if those are the 6 items that are driving burnout, this is kind of one level down. So for those, 90% of those folks that answered that said they do have issues, where do you think yours are? and, answer the one that would be the most that you may have. Is it the workload? Is it lack of control? Is it rewards? Is it this community? Is it fairness? Or is it maybe these people aren't sure if they match the skills or the job that they have?
I would also say if this perhaps triggers another thought, another, contributing factor, please feel free to post that in the chat. Something else comes to mind. Any other drivers?
Right, got a couple more people still coming in.
Just want to acknowledge Ginger's comment, massive organizational restructuring. So yes, something we've certainly seen.
So, cool. So the winner is workload at 50%, followed at 26% afterwards of a lack of perceived control. That's interesting. A little bit on reward system. And I'm surprised with this one, honestly, Joe. I don't know about you, but the mismatched values and skills. So maybe that's, I wasn't sure where people were going to be a little bit with this. I expected the workload issue to be up there, but yeah, let's explore that maybe as
well. I'll take it as at least a good sign too, at least for the sake of this poll with this, particular wonderful audience of ours, that no one ticked the supportive community box. So that's in light of some data that, like I said already, is a little sobering, that's a ray of light right there that, this audience is noticing that the community is relatively supportive.
So if we know that burnout's real, how do we mitigate that? What does it look like? And I know you could kind of look at those 6 items and kind of reverse those, but specific activities or things that you can do. One is to create a sense of purpose and meaning for people leaders, particularly. That it isn't just you now manage 5 people. Why are you here? What is engaging for you? What are you trying to accomplish? And how does that purpose and meaning align with, what you value? And in this burnout research, they found that managers who are experiencing true burnout with those 3 items we shared earlier scored a staggering 46% lower on feeling that their job makes good use of their skills and abilities.
Yeah.
So being able to have coaching conversations where a leader of these leaders say, how can we best use your skills and abilities? What do you want to do? How could we adjust pieces of a role where we can? How do we make sure that the people we hire on your team best align with who you are and what you need? Trying to find meaning, I think, is really important.
Well, and I want to add a little something to that too. And hearing you talk, Steve, one of the things that also makes me think of, particularly I've noticed this with, let's say frontline managers, people who are young, kind of in their leadership trajectory, is having conversation with their leaders where they can see how what they do matters. Now, it may sound simple to say that out loud, but I've been in these conversations where someone who's in a managerial role, they can't necessarily trace the line of their impact and see how it fits even within kind of the larger organizational vision. So it's this idea of like, well, what am I contributing to? What am I a part of, right? And how do I fit in that? And where does my value stand in that? And when that gets a little murky, a little nebulous, we see things start to unravel.
The second item here, and this again comes from this HBR study, is, and this kind of from the study augmented with Joe's and I's experiences with clients, but we believe this one to be true too, is learning and development. That, as we saw earlier, 1 in 5 managers say that they're not sure that they want to be a manager. And some of that comes from just their anxiety around having managerial type conversations, giving people feedback, holding people accountable, having challenging conversations, leaning into others watching you and what you do. So providing learning and development where people can practice those skills
Grow their
help to
confidence.
get a manager more comfortable and reduce anxiety. Like, oh, I got to run on my staff meeting. I don't know how to run a good staff meeting. What if somebody today, says this to me? And, they're not sleeping the night before events. So the more we can equip them with the skills and abilities, the less likely they're going to have burnout. Not to mention, they're going to be more effective at the work itself. Third one is flexible work. So kind of on a different kind of puzzle piece here is creating more flexibility in the work. In this data and research findings, we said managers who are experiencing true burnout scored 35% lower in feeling supported to work in a way that best works for them. So when somebody is a manager and you're trusting them to lead other people, if you're micromanaging when and where and how they work, that can be, counterproductive to the person feeling empowered. So again, their manager or having networks of people to say, how could you work in a way that makes sense? Or looking at people's schedule and go, I'm already scheduled 37 hours a week in standing, meetings just to do my work part of my job. Where do I fit in the managing these other people part of my job? So making sure that work can be flexible and organizations are thinking through that.
Well, and Steve, in hearing you say that, I would add this to safety and trust. And I think this comes back to relationship building. How we're building relationships, developing rapport, cultivating a sense of safety in the relationship that builds trust so that we can have these kinds of conversations. Because even the conversation around flexible work, right? If I'm a manager and I'm needing more, whether I need a more flexibility in my work schedule, maybe there are different things that I want to push off my plate and try some new stretch opportunities. It's like, I've been in those conversations where for some people to have the volition to take that initiative to broach this as a topic, they're scared. They're reluctant. There's reticence there. So I think even when we talk about flexible work, it's still anchored in something, in some cases at least, like how we're building relationships, how we're building trust, that type of thing.
Yeah. And I'm seeing in the chat too that comments about that a lot of managers are working managers, as we talked about it, working leaders,
Yes.
which creates this extra expectation or accountability of the workload they have on their plate and the need to manage others. Or maybe they're not fully managing others. They're, I hear these stories of, somebody who says, I haven't talked to my manager in 2 months. They're busy. We don't have regular meetings, or I'm in a meeting with them about work, but they don't sit down with me and do a one-on-one and talk with me. I mean, some of those basic fundamental things are challenging for.
Well, especially if you add in if you're not in office, or if you're not, I've also seen it too, if you're not in the same state or if you're not in the same country, if the manager you report to, if there's a 5-hour time difference, and I've seen lapses just like what you're describing, Steve.
Well, the fourth one here is community and support. This is driven around, the popular term of creating psychological safety in a workplace. So, managers also have concerns saying that they feel safe speaking up. This isn't just an hourly or first level employee situation. That managers are like, hey, to keep my job, I'm just going to do what I'm told. And they relay that to their employees too. So in this data, we found that 34%, or there was a 34 points lower score for those that were burnt out to the statement of somebody saying, I feel that it's safe to speak up at work. So if, that's going to directly contribute to burnout, somebody feeling a victim, so what's going on around them? Is that them and them finding their own voice and agency? And they really could, and they're encouraged, but they just are a little personally intimidated. And it's a mindset thing. Or is there really something to be said about their boss or their boss's boss, or sort of giving them messages of just like, don't rock the boat. I don't care. Get it done. And that's not going to be a sustainable solution. So these people feel on an island.
And that's where I would also say, back to the leadership development or learning and development, even coaching piece, that's where we can see individuals grow in terms of their confidence, so that even regardless of the culture around them, they do feel more empowered, they are more self-aware, they recognize their own agency to initiate these conversations. They have the skill and the support system in place to be able to facilitate that, and they can get the wheel spinning.
And the last one to mitigate burnout is to provide self-care, to be able to say it's okay to be able to mark off some time on your calendar where you need time to do work, so you're not having to do it at night. You need to be able to role model healthy behaviors on when you work as a leader of other people. And having organizations, those more enduring long-term organizations are solving for people, running marathons, not trying to sprint a marathon and find that at mile marker 10 they're falling over and exhaustion. They've created situations where their workforce can manage. Can't get sponsorship to teach and do that. So I don't think organizations are practicing this. I mean, I read about it a lot in the popular literature about how important it is to do these well-being initiatives, and organizations have well-being efforts and programs, but is it really translating to an employee to say, I'm going to learn how to be able to show up with my saw sharpened every day, and if I'm not, I'm going to listen to that and take time, and I know it's safe to do that. I'm just not seeing as much of that, and I think long term it's something that's needed. So, little more thought on what else we could do related to this, and this is from Gartner's point of view. And then after this, Joe and I are going to share some of the practical experiences and pieces that we see with clients that we work with. So Gardner's view, and we will share, I think I put this in the chat, we'll share a PDF of Gardner's study this last year. They came up with some kind of good ideas here as well. But first is to reset role expectations, to be able to have conversations that empower managers to connect on what does it mean to be, as we've talked about today, a working manager. How much of it is working and how much of it is managering, if you will, and being able to talk about that level of expectation with your workforce. Having open, deep conversations, working with VPs or skip level folks who can sit down with people and have those conversations. So HR and talent development folks prompting efforts that say, we need to be having more real life conversations. Second is to build a manager's pipeline, encouraging aspiring leaders to want to be a leader. If you're not using pre-hire assessments or assessments as you think about promoting people, consider doing that. We find a lot of great value with that. And you can really look at somebody's personality type, motivators, drivers, and see if they really will thrive in a role of leading others. Or are they just saying, I want to step up into that because I think I'm supposed to do that next? And they're miserable and they'd be a better individual contributor. So making sure as you do talent planning that you're thinking about and assessing the right folks that can be leaders of others, and then naturally go, I'm good with this level of, ambiguity. I'm good with having tough conversations with other people. I can manage that work. I think that's really important.
I would also emphasize that last sentence too, where it talks about normalizing opting out of management. Just to echo the same sentiment of having these conversations where, we are able to really uncover a person's ambitions. Like, is this something that they're really eager to do? Is this something that actually motivates them, something that really inspires them? Or is it just kind of the next rung in the ladder that they think they're supposed to take? So it's like, well, okay. And, maybe there's a pay bump. So fine, I guess that's the step I'm going to take. I go back to it again, kind of that relationship building, having those open, trusted dialogues.
The third is rewiring managers' habits. So equipping managers to build their own strong people management habits, that they have routines of working with their employees, of scheduling out time in their day to be able to do these manager activities, and they're not always behind the 8 ball, and that they are taking control over their schedule and not just, somebody asked me to go to a meeting, I go to a meeting. Like, tell me why my participation is helpful here. What do I need to do? Like, having them think about their habits in ways where they own their own kind of plot of land of their area of responsibility, and not just, I do what I'm told, but I'm a manager of people. Like, that really is not an effective mousetrap. There was a question that came into us too, I think it's a good time to maybe bring this up. I do agree workload causes burnout. Sometimes there are more capacity for managers. Some of it is making sure efficiencies are utilized, and some is perception of what's busy is what busy is versus the data. How do we change mindsets of what busy looks like? I think that's a great observation about, is busy and scheduled out what's rewarded in your organization? And is that something you should stamp out? And I guess the question, and I don't know if you want to start with that, is, how do you change mindsets of what busy looks like for organizations and managers?
I think that's a myriad of conversations, right? I think about it even from like a trickle down effect. I think, what's the organizational attitude towards that? What's senior leadership leadership's attitude towards that, down to, then the individual. Like, I think if those are not aligned, then, it creates a little bit of chaos, and it creates some of a situation what we're describing here today. So it's like an onion. I think that has layers.
Yeah. And I think we do need to have conversations both in the training classes that we teach and in, town halls or managerial meetings that we might have, is the expectation that a manager has time to think creatively, to innovate, to challenge assumptions. Like, that's part of your leadership competencies. It's not doer sets of activities. So go back to what you said you're supposed to do as a leader of other people, and allow soak time in your day to be able to
well, and I guess also just speaking from the experience end of that, let's say an individual or a manager works with a coach, or let's say they go through a series of facilitations as part of a program, and they're doing the work on themselves. If that is not then supported culturally, if their leader or their skip level or however high you want to go is not supportive to that, this is where we are then, right? So that's why I kind of said earlier, it's got texture, it's got layers. These things are moving pieces that have to be more aligned than not in order for it to, I think, really flourish.
We see that even in pockets in organizations where one director or VP, for whatever reason, is an all-in leader that wants to work, 15 hours a day, and it trickles to their staff. So the even though the organization may espouse these certain values on work-life balance and alignment and schedule, what practically happens in some areas is, this area, it's not okay to leave before 6 o'clock, or it's not okay to, leave Friday afternoons as pre-work meeting time, because you're not supposed to schedule meetings, but somebody does anyway. And somebody more senior saying, hey, we're running as a company, not as an organization. You're not the whole organization. And
This
that's
is a really quick, short. This, in my years as working as a coach, this surprisingly came up somewhat consistently. This small example, that of time management and calendar management, and people trying to be very intentional, very deliberate over allocating, even let's say a Monday morning or Friday afternoon, where they would put boundaries around like a 2-hour block, or maybe even hour block, to just say, okay, I'm going to use this time to do some strategic planning, perhaps, just as low-hanging fruit an example. But how what they would run into, just as kind of cultural norms, people would just schedule over. Even if they blocked it out on their calendar, people would just schedule over that time. And then now they were in a position where they would have to have conversations. And for some, then that would build anxiety. Be like, okay, I got to talk to so-and-so about this. So there's a little bit of a domino effect. Whereas if kind of as an organization, as a culture, especially from the top down, if this is our stance and we're holding each other accountable to it, that's how we can see positive, sustainable change take place.
And to that end, the last one from Gardner's words were remove process hurdles. So enable HR leaders to eliminate low value rules that burden managers and employees. So, think about maybe places in your organization where you're asking a leader to, submit some data because you're being a little, big brother's watching possibly, and do you really need that? Or, eliminating certain work rules or things that you don't think work for a certain area. But look at processes that maybe burden a leader. And how do you know what those look like? Well, simply put, you ask managers, you sit down and you talk about what really frustrates you about being here. When you go home and you're like, I like parts of my job, but you know what's the craziest thing that I have to do? I don't even get it. Like, capture that, figure it out, create safe environments where people can say, boy, I can get a lot more done if we didn't do this thing, or explain to me why we do it and help me understand it and feel good about it. But that kind of place of being in the middle of just like, I do something regularly that I resent, is not a healthy place for an adult, anybody.
Well said.
So in Dion leadership terms, we tried to boil this down to something we thought was a pretty simple model. That there's really 4 things at play here to create a sustainable solution. And you can build an initiative or effort around this. One is the self, is the manager, is the person that is leading this, equipping them, not just saying, hey, you're a leader, figure it out, go Google stuff. Like, our job is to help that leader be the best self they can be through community, through training, through their manager's responsibility, through helping to explain what a good leader looks like, to putting a leader in the right role to be a leader, but having activities around improving each person's self. The second is the work itself, helping to work through what work do they have? What's a sustainable job? Once in a while I hear things where somebody has 84 direct reports. I'm like, how can that be? Like, you really don't, maybe you have a team of 84 and nobody has a manager. Don't burden the leader to say, by the way, you are responsible for everything that happens to 84 people every day. Like, that person's brain's going to explode. That's not a legit kind of, practical way you can, run a business. So look at the work, look at workload, look at, if somebody's left and somebody else all of a sudden is folded in their job, figure that out regularly. And then the third is their leadership. And I think this is where HR needs to really find a voice and go into senior leadership and say, if you want managerial effectiveness here, it mostly starts with you and what you do and how they see you lead, what you ask of people, the decisions that senior leadership makes every day on structure, on commitments to projects. Yeah, let's just throw in another, implement this technology and put these 5 people on this team without knowing that, their job's already overburdened, like helping leadership know that they own this is a problem. And then the wraparound is your culture, which is the hardest one to change long-term. Is, do you have a culture that is an employee first culture, that is a leader first culture, that says we want people to come here and stay? So therefore, one of the things you can expect of us is to have a leader that's present, that's authentic, that treats you well. We saw some of the data earlier that said, I don't know what the number was, but it was like about 50% of employees feel like they're not respected by management at their workplace. Like, are you creating conditions where your culture says that stuff isn't tolerated?
Well,
So you got 4 legs to this stool that I think is how you can kind of eat this elephant.
Yeah, and I think where we see this done well is in organizations that look at it as an organizational priority rather than only an HR priority.
Well said. So what are some of the practical things you can do about it? We've already talked through some of these things. One is to create communities that treat leaders as valuable. And how do you do that? Create forums with leaders. Maybe there's town halls just for leaders of people, not everybody sitting in the same town hall meeting. There's other
resource
practices
groups,
within departments.
yeah, I've seen resource groups be very impactful with this. I've seen group coaching also, where you have, let's say, managers across a variety of different functions, but are all at the same level. They will more or less work as a cohort or as a pod, and work with a coach as a group, and it really fosters a strong support system. Really fosters just forges great bonds, and can be very, very impactful.
Do that work, and just through regular managerial work, is just listen to managers, both pulse surveys that are directed at managers, but direct meetings with leaders of people to talk about people leading and their personal satisfaction, whether you call them, stay interviews, whether you call them, I was talking to a client just yesterday about, doing, talent pipeline review meetings and be able to have somebody in the talent team carve out time to sit with high potential leaders and talk to them, not only their manager do it, but separately through talent development, to talk about, does the person feel fulfilled and satisfied, and what does a long-term plan look like here, and how can we make that happen? And then act on that feedback. If we say that, we're going to give you tools and resources, maybe you're filling out timesheets as a leader and you're like, this is ridiculous, and we're going to bring in a tool. Well, let's do it and connect that. You asked us for this, we created this for you, and this is what's happening. Some organizations feel like their performance management system's a little burdensome for their managers to manage through. Having dialogue, listening to the manager, figuring out the right sweet spot there, and then acting on that.
Well, I would say too, this is one of the more common places where you lose people, is because if I finally have the conviction to share with you, areas where I think improvement may be possible, but it's not acted on. Now we're back to, where is my voice? Where is my impact? Now, to use the word I used at the beginning, I feel a little bit more invisible. And the longer that goes on, then the more common the conversation around engagement and retention starts to increase.
Yeah. And then whenever we talked through this, and it was in a lot of the chats here, getting real about workload. I know there was a comment in healthcare about, managers, our working managers. We do a lot of work in healthcare. Those folks are so overburdened all the time. What does it look like for us to be able to create realistic workloads that somebody can walk into their week going, I can feel good by the end of this day or week that I accomplished what I needed to accomplish, not, yeah, I'm behind again. I feel like I let people down again. Like over time, that's going to go back to those 3 burnout items, which make people less productive over time. So getting senior leadership involved in that decision making, because it might be a budgetary impact. It might be like, we need more people. Like, are we okay with running at a different short-term ratio of profitability, but long-term we need to do this so that we're not, churning through people and spending money on recruiters, etc.
I well said, Steve. I was just going to say the same thing. I mean, I think you can't have this conversation without addressing the likelihood that it could very well place a demand for more honest, deliberate conversations, even maybe a little bit of pushing back, doubling down, digging in with senior leadership.
Yeah. And then at the same time, work is work, right? And jobs are crazy, and they're not super always easy and linear and in a nice, neat package. So we should help change the mindset for leaders to be more flexible, to be more agile, to feel in control of their day, to be able to have the conversations they need to have, to let things go. So we're going to talk a little bit next about what might that development look like for them to feel like they have the skills to be able to do what you're asking of them. And then last, and then we'll get into kind of the next, this last little section in our last 10 minutes here, is to look at the culture from the top. And are they doing these things? What do they need to do to know that they are contributing to this? And we've had this conversation already. I think it's one you just have to lead into. And we have a slide at the end with some practical ideas.
Yeah, so Steve mentioned agility just now, and, unsurprisingly, in times of tumult and volatility, there's this precipice where we can really start to focus on that which is outside of our control. And stress and anxiety, they love that. It's its own little dish. So in doing this work, we really try to focus on differentiating reaction from response. And part of that is embedded in your self-awareness, your mindset, your behavior, identifying what lies within your locus of control. So if we're looking to the left, uncommonly perhaps, there's a little bit more of this kind of reflexive, reactionary way of how we, show up when a situation unfolds in front of us. And this is where it tends to be more automatic, impulsive, emotional, at times it risks being short-sighted, only centered on the self, and just can create more problems, if you will. Where when we talk about being agile, part of what we're looking for is one's ability to respond. And we're not just trying to be playful with words here, but rather than merely react. And that, at the very least, means taking 90 seconds to give yourself pause and grace and to collect before you make the decision. So what we wanted to do today was just at a high level, look at our leadership agility model and say, okay, like, well, if we're going to talk about agility, let's not just use and throw that word around, but let's get down to brass tacks. What does it mean to actually be agile as a leader? So once more, just looking at it at the highest of levels, we talk about, and this was mentioned earlier, having a confident understanding of my sense of purpose, okay, in my role and how well it aligns with my role and that of the organizations, as well as understanding myself, knowing my own values and how well they fit within that role and that of the organizations. Again, alignment would be key here, so that we already have a foundation in place, right? We have a compass, we have a North Star to kind of guide our decision making, so that when a situation arises, we can pause. As I mentioned a moment ago, we can check our mindset. We could take the time, however long it may be, to really identify a perspective that we think is a best fit for that situation, that will create the outcome that we know is ideal, whether it be for ourselves or for everyone involved. So that then, once we've identified the perspective and the mindset we want to endorse, our response is intentional, is deliberate. We can operate from a place of equanimity, a place of calmness, a place of almost even relaxation in some cases. So then we can do our part. We can't control everything, but again, what lies within our control to try to achieve the outcome that is the most desirable. And then lastly, we allocate time to reflect on the situation and to see what went well, maybe where there are development areas, but the more we reflect, the more we're able to actually extract those takeaways, which is great cannon fodder for our sense of purpose and better understanding ourselves.
Thanks, Joe. We wanted to share this so you can see, the difference of when you teach a leader skills, tools, mindsets, approaches like this in a half day or day class, it helps them step into the spotlight of their role versus how, teaching them how to, fill out the performance review form online, or some of the basic kind of, policy things that you do for leaders, but teaching them these mindset skills are really, really important, and we think are a way that you can get a lot of results as well.
It reminds them of agency, which can empower them.
There's a whole list of classes and resources and tools that you need. These are ones that we share at the supervisor, manager, director level. We're planning to go through this, but just to say, think about each leader and what they may need, and you can create community through leadership development programs. We have a lot of clients that are bringing all of their managers together through a 1 or 2 or 3 day workshop, and kind of refreshing, reinvigorating them about why they're a leader. And it's not just a town hall meeting where somebody's talking at them, they're getting skill development, but you're also getting community.
Yes.
And for those more senior people, put them through a bigger program. So this would be an example of something that we do regularly with, over the course of a year. They do a 360, you do a kind of communal session, they get some coaching, you do a couple more days together, virtual or in person. Put those leaders you don't want to lose, who you think are suffering from burnout. If you look at those 3 burnout items, actually lean into giving them something to invigorate them by putting them through a 6 to 9 month long program like this. And then last, even at the first level leader level, this would be, content, you're just getting people to even do a disc management where it understands their style about managing, directing, delegating, how to manage up, doing some basic, information and training around communication, performance, feedback. And you could trade out any of those classes if you have, this is 3 days to any of the ones on the right, to be able to show tools and things that they need.
Yeah, Steve, I was going to mention too, Ginger had mentioned in the chat earlier, massive restructuring. So what we've even seen, I can think of in the last quarter of 23 was some demand around change management in some of our programs. Just as another example.
Yeah. So we wanted to reiterate what started us down this journey to have this conversation is in Gartner's top 5 HR priorities list, management leadership development was #1. We're going to send you the study so you can read the other 4 as well. But that's really why we think this is important. And if it's not reaching the top for your organization, hopefully this gives you some of the data that you need to say to your senior team, we should carve out a separate initiative. And so then in closing, I think some of those initiative things might look like things around, specific activities to support managers and actively engaging their senior team. So it may include things like, separate town hall meetings we mentioned, maybe skip level meetings where senior people go 2 or 3 levels down. It might be, adding assessments to ensure you're hiring the right people. It's the training activities we talked about. I mean, there's a whole list of things you can do. Creating separate recognition systems for people managers who do some extraordinary people management things, but do something for these 1st and 2nd level people managers. Second is to create communication systems. We talked a little bit about that. We want to make sure we reinforced it. We didn't really talk about this last one here, is understanding the role of hybrid working relationships. I think that could be a whole webinar in and of itself, is if people are home, they're away, if they're managing people remotely, kind of helping figure out what does it look like to be a leader. Just because you're working at home, one of the things you find out is from the data is people aren't shutting their computer off. They end up working a lot because they're working from home. So being able to teach and how to set boundaries if you're a hybrid worker. And then, and this is in one of the other comments as well, is taking a closer look at processes, workload, and balancing that short and long-term need, like really having tough conversations with your senior team. Like what you're asking is really not a sustainable model, and we got to figure out how to get there. And then last, as we mentioned, is provide leadership training that helps managers change their mindset to be more agile. So even if you can't change the work, that's a harder situation to say, we really need double the amount of managers. I mean, you getting there is a large lift. But if you take your current managers and give them some skills and tools and abilities to at least say, let's help you prioritize this challenging workload you have, that's probably something you could squeeze into your year. So thanks for listening. I hope you found this helpful. We also wanted to share in closing, as we get to the top of the hour here, if you would like to learn more, we have a couple other speaking events happening. Our Joe is going to be speaking at Michigan HR Day. So for those of you that are in the Michigan area near where we are, there's an in-person event all day on April 10th in Lansing. And we'll be talking about managing conflict effectively. And as part of that, we will be giving out a free assessment, productive conflict assessment. And I just wanted to share, if you can't attend that event and you want either the slides or talk about that, or you want the assessment itself, we'd be happy to share more with you if conflict is an issue within your organization. And then our next DN Leadership webinar is going to be on May 14th, and super excited to have on this program here Dr. Michael Genord, who is the CEO of Health Alliance Plans, and Vicki Walker, who is a DN leadership person who's been his coach and their team coach, to walk through their 5-year journey on how they developed what we think is now an extraordinary C-suite team. And now they have a award-winning talent or team development program. So we think that is worth showing off, and you hearing directly from him as a CEO what executive team development really looks like and how he supports that. So the chat should be showing the link to join that. You'll be seeing some emails as well. With that, Joe, anything else before we sign off?
No, just thank everyone for their participation in what we think is a really important and timely conversation. So just great to see everyone turn out today. And as always, we're available to continue the conversation. If anybody is interested in just learning more about how we approach this and the work that we do, I am here to support you. So please don't ever hesitate to reach out, even if you just want to talk shop for a half hour.
Thanks so much, everybody. Have a wonderful day.
Take care, everyone. Best wishes.